Hi there, and welcome to the Fantasy Baseball Dad. This is an introduction to fantasy baseball. This video is meant to be for people who are brand new to fantasy baseball or just looking to learn more about it or thinking about playing or whatever it might be. But this is definitely geared towards more of the rookie fantasy baseball person than the veteran fantasy baseball person. Hopefully, if you're watching this video, you're either already have decided to play fantasy baseball or are thinking about it or just starting out. Whatever the reason, I strongly encourage you to play. It's a lot of fun. You get to have a lot of cool stories, make some cool friendships, have some cool experiences, and you get to learn a lot. And it's a lot of fun, and it really doesn't take that much time to be pretty good at it. So I really encourage you to watch the rest of this video, and hope you enjoy it, and hope you enjoy playing fantasy baseball as much as I did. So let's dive right in here first, and let's talk about what is fantasy baseball. So fantasy baseball, to put it simply, is where a baseball fan compiles a team of real life players and looks at their real life stats and compares their team stats with another team's stats. Now, there's a number of different ways that you can compare stats and that you can compile your teams, and I'm going to go through those. But first off, if you're looking at where you can play fantasy baseball, there's a number of good sites you can play on. I play mostly on ESPN. I know that's a pretty popular one. I think they have a good interface, and that's a good one to play on. Yahoo is also very popular, and I've played on that one before. Fox Sports, CBS, Flea Flicker, and MLB.com all also offer a fantasy baseball product that's pretty good as well. I've played on most of these, and there's not too many differences between each of them, other than just what the interface might look like. So just look around and see which one you're most comfortable and with, looking at the players with, and looking at your team with, and choose there. So I'll have links to each of these sites on where you can join a fantasy baseball league for each of these sites down in the comments below. All right, now there are three different main types of leagues in fantasy baseball. There's rotisserie, head-to-head categories, and head-to-head points. Now, if you played fantasy football before, head-to-head points is probably the one that you're most familiar with, since that's pretty similar to how most fantasy football leagues are run. Now I'm going to run through each of these and what the differences are. So in a rotisserie league, you track stats across an entire season, and then you compare your season stats with each other team's season stats, and you look at the rank in each category for those stats. So if, for example, if home runs is one of your stats in your rotisserie league, and you have a total of 10 teams in your rotisserie league, if you rank first in home runs, you'll get 10 points for that category. And if you rank second, you'll only get 9 points. And if you're all the way down at the bottom and rank last in home runs, then you'll only get 1 point. And so you get points like that for each category that you're measuring in that league, and then you sum up those points, and whoever has the most points at the end of the season wins. So those points are compiled throughout as the season goes, so you'll see your rank go up and down throughout the season. But this offers an interesting strategy because you have to have a balanced team that's competitive in at least most of the categories that your league is measuring. You have to be competitive over an entire season, not just on a shorter time frame. And so most points at the end of the season wins. All right, now in a head-to-head category league, instead you're tracking weekly stats, and then you compare your weekly stats with one other team in your league. So sticking with the home run example, if you're going against one other team in a particular week, whichever team hits the most home runs that week will get the win for that category. So they'd be 1-0 that week for that category. Now say RBIs was also another category that you're measuring. If the other team scores more RBIs than your team for that week, you would lose that category. So you'd be 1-1 for that week, and so on for each category that you're measuring. Now also the other difference with a head-to-head category league is you typically have playoff teams. So there's a time period towards the end of the season where the teams with the best records will compete in a playoff bracket using the same type of scoring from week to week and to determine who ultimately wins the league. All right, moving on to head-to-head points leagues. Similarly to head-to-head categories in that you track weekly stats and compare those stats against one other team, but instead your stats compile points. So, for example, if you have a pitcher and he gets 5 strikeouts in a game, and you get 2 points for each strikeout, then you would get 10 points that day for that pitcher. Or if you have a hitter who gets a point for each run he scores, and he scores 2 runs that day, you would get 2 points from that player. And so you add up all your points for the entire week, and whoever has the most points at the end of the week gets a win. So, for example, if you're going against an opponent and you score 300 points that week and your opponent scores 350 points, you would lose that week. So you'd be 0-1 and your opponent would be 1-0 for that week. And then also in head-to-head points leagues, you typically have playoffs there as well. So similar to head-to-head categories, at the end of the season, the best teams will play in a playoff bracket together. All right, now moving on to how you compile your teams. There are two main different draft types. The first, and it's auction and snake. Now, how an auction draft works is each team is assigned a budget. So it might be $100, might be $200, might be $250 is a common one you see. But every team has the same allotted budget to work with for the draft. And then each team takes turns nominating a player, but then every team has the opportunity to bid on that player using the money from their allotted budget. Now, whichever team has the highest bid wins the player, and whatever the winning bid is, that comes out of their budget, and so they now have fewer dollars to work with for the rest of the draft. Now, in a snake draft, this might be more of what you're used to, since this is kind of how drafting in the real MLB and most major sports works, is each team just takes a turn picking one player at a time, starting with team one, going to the team at the end. Now, typically with these drafts, when you say you have 10 teams in your league, whichever team ends up picking 10th, so picks last, and every other team has had an opportunity to pick, typically they'll also pick first at the end of the next round. So they'll have the 10th pick and then the 11th pick, which means if you pick first, very first overall, you won't be picking again until pick 20, but then you also get a pick right away again at pick 21. So you kind of rotate back and forth up and down the line, taking turns picking players. Now, another thing to consider if you're brand new to fantasy baseball is how often you want to update your roster or your lineup. There's two main options of updating weekly or updating daily. Now, they're both pretty similar, both pretty basic. In a weekly updating, typically the week goes from Monday to Sunday. So whenever the first game on Monday starts, whichever players you have in your lineup and whichever players you have on your bench lock there, and you can no longer move them for the entire week, for the rest of the week. And that also includes adding or dropping players. So if there's a free agent that you want to pick up, you have to do it before games start on Monday, or you can't use them until the following week. Now, this is a little bit nicer for newer players that are new to fantasy baseball because they only have to check and update your lineup once a week to really be active in the league. Now, in a daily lineup, similar to weekly, only every day your lineup locks at the beginning of the first game, or at the beginning of each player's game in some cases. Which means if you have, for example, 8 pitchers, but you can only start 6 at a time, you can rotate those 8 pitchers into those 6 spots day to day, depending on who's pitching that day. Now, this is a little bit more dedication because you're checking your lineup every day and updating your lineup every day. So sometimes it's a little more intimidating if you're new to fantasy baseball to do a daily league. But it's also a little more fun because it gives you a little bit more flexibility and you get to use more players. So depending on your situation, you can decide which one is best for you. All right, another thing to consider as well is if you want to play in a redraft league or a keeper league. Now, in a redraft league, regardless of your draft type, at the end of the season, you lose your entire team, and you'll draft a brand new team at the start of the next season. Now, keeper is kind of the opposite. In a keeper league, you can keep a certain number of players on your roster from one season and carry them over to your roster on the next season. Now, this varies on the league. In some leagues, it's just 2 or 3 or 4 players, and in other leagues, it's every single player on your roster that you have the option to keep if you want. Now, this changes how you value players in a keeper league because say you have 2 shortstops that are producing similar stats this season, but one of them's a veteran 38-year-old shortstop who's maybe getting close to retirement, and the other one's a 24-year-old, younger shortstop who's newer to the league. And they're both putting up similar numbers. In a redraft league, you don't really care if they're putting up similar numbers, like you value them the same. But in a keeper league, you're probably going to value the 24-year-old shortstop more because you'll be able to keep him if he keeps producing and keep him for longer on your team. So it changes the way you value players if you play in a keeper league. So it's something to keep in mind as you're looking at which type of league you want to join. Now, those are the main things, but there's a few other things that you might want to consider. For example, you might want to consider how many teams are in the league. The more teams that are in the league, the deeper into the player pool you're going to go, and so the more players you're going to have to be familiar with and be able to value. So if you're newer, you probably want to play in a smaller league, like either 10 or maybe even 8-team league. And along with that, you also want to consider a number of playoff teams from that league that make the playoffs if you're playing in head-to-head categories or points, and also roster sizes. Now, if you're playing in a 10-team league and each team gets 20 players, then you're going 200 players deep into the player pool. But if you're playing in a 10-team league and each team gets 25 players, then you're going 250 players deep into the player pool. So it's not just the number of teams you have to in the league you have to consider, but it's also the size of the rosters that you want to consider. So again, if you're newer to fantasy baseball, you might want to be looking for a league that has closer to 20 or so players on the roster rather than 25 or 30 or somewhere in that neighborhood. Another thing as well is what kind of categories you account for, regardless of what type of league you're playing in. That's something that's important to know because it changes the way that you value players. A very common example you see is some leagues will look at batting average as a category for hitters, and other leagues will look at on-base percentage as a category for hitters. Now you can have, two players that hit 260 as a batting average, but one of them might walk more than the other. So one of them might have an on-base percentage of, say, 330, while the first one has an on-base percentage of 280 and just doesn't walk as much, draw as many walks, which improves your on-base percentage. So you'd value that player with a higher on-base percentage more in an on-base percentage league. But if you're playing in a batting average league, you'd value those players the same, at least in that particular category. So it's something to consider. If you're unsure of which categories you're accounting for, review the rules in that league and it'll explain it. And then also a trade deadline. Make sure your league has a trade deadline. Trading is a fun thing in fantasy baseball, but it's good to have a trade deadline before teams get to the end and towards the playoffs, because you don't want to see teams completely tanking or trade away all of their best players, and so it's good to have a trade deadline at some point in the season. All right, now to summarize, there's 4 main things you'll want to consider. First is your league type, either rotisserie, head-to-head category, or head-to-head points. Your draft type, an auction or a snake. How often you want to update your roster, either weekly or daily. And then how often you want to update from season to season. Do you want to do a redraft league, or do you want to have the option to potentially keep some of your favorite players from your team for the next season? Now, if you're brand new to fantasy baseball and looking for the basic kind of simple league to join, these are the teams the settings that I would recommend. I would look at a head-to-head points league that does a snake draft and only updates weekly with a redraft setting, so you don't get to keep any players. And again, I mentioned earlier, but I would be looking at a league that's either 10 teams or maybe even 8 teams. If you're feeling real adventurous, you can go up to 12, but I think 10 is the perfect ideal to start with if you're brand new with these settings. All right, so that's a quick run through of fantasy baseball. I hope that made sense. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to comment down below. And don't forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. I'll be posting videos with fantasy baseball advice and kind of profiling players and talk about some of the strategies that I use while playing fantasy baseball. So subscribe to my YouTube channel, and I also have a Twitter account. It's FTSY Baseball Dad on Twitter. So follow me there as well, and I'll throw my videos up there while I'm coming out with them. So thanks for joining, and I'll catch you next time.